And welcome to another episode of Bitcoin Magazine Live. It is Tuesday, September 6th. I'm coming to you yet again from my mother's basement. I'm joined by my co-host, P. How goes it, P?
As always, it goes phenomenally. I've got my collared shirt on. I'm ready to rock. I'm excited after the holiday weekend. What'd you guys do to celebrate?
I don't remember.
I'll fill it in. Q smoked a bunch of stuff. We don't have to talk about it on air. I went to a barbecue with my girlfriend. She made the rookie mistake of eating breakfast before going to a barbecue. She was full. I was full, and I didn't eat breakfast. So great weekend, great barbecue. It was awesome.
I will say I did do a very gross thing, and that was I went to a water park, which actually was surprisingly fun, but I needed to chase my 6-day streak at the beach with like a change of scenery a little bit. So that was a good time. What'd you do, P?
I went on some hikes. I made some amazing food. That's about it. It was great. Caught up with some reading.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
Went to Costco. Yeah.
Oh, wow. The holiday weekend Costco trip is a bold move. Like, what'd you commit? Like 6 hours?
I was 13, actually.
Nice.
Got outside. Became homeless. Cardboard box, the most luxurious cardboard box ever. Had a little camp stove, some music, made some new friends, some new enemies, and, all in a day's work.
Nice. I stand by this, and I'm hard pressed to find a different answer, although I'm sure there are some superstores in Texas that would give me a run for my money with this statement. But I will always say, in the event of a zombie apocalypse, I will be holed up at your local Costco.
There you go.
Is there a better place?
You could last a while off the pound of Twizzlers. Those you can survive for a while. I heard they have a pretty extensive dog food section. I'm looking after P here. Just great pallets of stuff.
Love it.
I mean, they also have like grills and stuff, but sure. Yeah. We'll eat Twizzlers. We got news and notes. We'll kick off in just a second. And because it was a long weekend and I'm still recovering and hungover, we're going to have a shorter stream today, but we're going to be joined by the young gun market guru himself, Dylan LeClair, as our guest for today. But let's dive into news and notes. The arguably most recognizable face in all of podcast land, Joe Rogan, finally admit to owning Bitcoin in an interview with Kamaru Usman on his MMA show, not the Joe Rogan Experience or his main show that everyone actually pays attention to, the shitty smaller one that actually like made him famous because he somehow got looped in with MMA and the UFC. He admit when he was asked, do you hold any cryptocurrencies? He said Bitcoin. That was it. Didn't really elongate that. So I'm just going to go ahead and put my stamp of approval on orange-pilled guru Joe Rogan.
This is a huge deal. I feel like he's been interviewing people who are, into Bitcoin, who understand why it's so important and understand the differences between Bitcoin and some of the other alternatives for a long time. And it's been this kind of thing in the Bitcoin community, like, when will it happen? When will he admit it? And so, I think this is huge. I think this is, I'm excited for him to openly talk about Bitcoin on his podcast in the future. I think that so many of the things that Joe Rogan stands for and talks about and explores with his guests align really well with Bitcoin. So excited for the future.
Yeah, P and I had the luxury of being at BitBlock Boom and hearing Adam Curry, also known as the Podfather, talk. He's been on Joe Rogan's show 4 times. And he was saying every time he goes on, he brings up a little like nugget about Bitcoin on every one of the times he's been on. And, every time he goes on, he gets like, he's like, my Twitter, as soon as the episode airs, is just berated with people being like, you should bring on this person. You should tell him about Sailor. You should tell him about Safedine. Like all these different people. He's like, guys, slowly. Joe is not dumb. He will reach out when he wants to go to anyone in the community. And, he's has enough experience and grandeur that whoever he invites will most likely go on. It's only a matter of time, but he's like just one moment at a time. But it was very, very interesting to hear him finally say he owns Bitcoin, because I feel like every time it was brought up, he just kind of like, he's like, oh yeah. And then they just kind of changes the topic, but it was very, very interesting to say that he actually owns Bitcoin. He also didn't say he owns any other cryptocurrencies. So that was interesting to know. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, but definitely owns Bitcoin, or at least that's what he says. So really excited for it. Big news.
All I know is Joe Rogan has been a bit curious for some time. So I don't know. I thought that was really funny. P, let's go to the story that you absolutely hate.
No, I don't hate this at all. The question was, there was a Reddit thread over the weekend which got a bunch of engagement around and asking the question, why is cold storage important in Bitcoin? Like, why not just have it on a phone, for example, and deal with that? And I thought it was an interesting opportunity to go through. I would, we'll probably put the link to the Reddit thread in the show notes or something, but I think it's an interesting opportunity to reiterate why we view cold storage and ideally air gapped cold storage as an important aspect in Bitcoin. And the biggest thing is that you don't want to have to trust, you want to minimize the amount of trust that you have to put in any single entity with regard to your Bitcoin. And in the past, it used to be this insane process. People who were really, really Bitcoin privacy focused and did not want to be beholden to an exchange. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. People would go buy a printer, they would remove the wireless card from the printer. They would print out their paper wallet, which is a thing of the past. Then they would smash the printer to make sure that like it was never compromised. Whereas now there's much, much better systems in place that allow you to maintain your own privacy, confidentiality, without having to go to those lengths. But in a nutshell, the reason that using cold storage solutions, and when we talk about cold storage, I think it's important to describe the spectrum, right? On the farthest end of the spectrum, if you are possessing Bitcoin, or in this case, not quite, you can buy Bitcoin on an exchange. And if you leave that Bitcoin on an exchange, you are trusting them to give you that Bitcoin when you ask for it back. So you actually don't even own Bitcoin at that point. You have an IOU. And that's very risky, as we've seen in many situations. Celsius is just one of the most recent ones where they can, at any time, decide, you know what, you don't actually own this Bitcoin anymore. We are freezing your accounts, and then you're fucked. So you don't want to be in that position ever. So then you can, take possession of your own Bitcoin and transfer it to, for example, a hot wallet on, for example, a cell phone. And the issue there is that even if you are, you're in control of your own private keys on your cell phone, that cell phone is an internet connected device and can still be theoretically compromised. That cell phone could be, taken from you at a checkpoint, and there could be backdoors installed in that cell phone by cell phone manufacturers, and those private keys could, in theory, be extracted from that device and then used to access your Bitcoin. Most importantly, if it's internet connected, there's just a lot of stuff you can't control. On a cell phone, there's a million other applications that are running. Ideally, those are sandboxed effectively. Cell phones tend to use, modern ones using secure enclaves, but still, there is a ton of software running on that device that you have no insight into and you never will. So that's still risky. Then you can go to a dedicated piece of hardware, a cold storage device. And that is a great solution because it's a purpose-built piece of hardware that does one thing and does it very well, and that is securely store your private keys and allow you to sign Bitcoin transactions in a way that, if you choose to, you can use air-gapped. And that means that basically that you can use it in such a way that that device never actually is connected to an internet-connected device directly. And that significantly improves and increases your privacy and your security, because then it's not, you're lowering you're making the attack surface of that device much smaller. And then there's even more extreme things you can do. You can go to a multi-sig situation where you have multiple hardware devices that you split up, and they are all required, or actually, let's say in this example, 2 of 3 of them are required to sign a specific Bitcoin transaction. And these are all just ways of increasing your security on Bitcoin, the most important asset that any of us will likely own. I've been rambling for a bit there, but I hope that was useful. Chris, Q, I'm curious, anything you'd add to that? Anything that you want to throw out there?
I think you covered a lot, and we've hammered the importance of cold storage so much on this show. I urge you, if you do not yet, if you just leave your Bitcoin on Coinbase, first off, you're not going to make it. Same candidly on Cash App, Strike, all of these applications, all these exchanges. But just as a gentle reminder, none of this is financial advice. Do your own due diligence. Know what you can tolerate. Know what risk appetite you have. But yeah, no. Listen to this man who knows far more than me, or I'll even throw Chris under this bus. Chris know about this type of stuff.
No, P, I think you said it very eloquently. I think there's levels to this. To Q's point, if you're leaving your Bitcoin on an exchange, that is a big no-no. Not financial advice, but it's better to be in a hot wallet than it is to be on an exchange, in my opinion. It's better to be in
100%.
cold storage than to be in a hot wallet, in my opinion. It's better to be in a separated, geographically diverse multi-sig than to be in just a single sig cold storage. So there's like levels to it. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good, or at least better. I think, there's steps to this, and you don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to be like Odell or some of the privacy experts with their level of setup and like anonymity. So yeah.
Cool. Let's keep chugging along. Chris, there was a frightening story making rounds on Twitter sphere. Could you walk us through it?
Yeah, this one's a little bit of a longer one, but I think it's very important, so I'll go into this one. So an anonymous Twitter account named Rizn, Rizzn, will be going to jail for the next 6 to 15 months for the crime of selling Bitcoin a few years ago. He's a journalist that's been in the space since 2011. He always been just one of hundreds of thousands of people on Paxful or Local Bitcoins. Those are two exchanges that are normally used to sell Bitcoin peer-to-peer, sell or buy Bitcoin peer-to-peer. And he was one of the hundreds of regular users of the site. As it turns out, he was being used as a mule in a lottery scam. On October 23rd of 2021, his house was raided by 15 armed agents who waved guns and search warrants in his face and proceeded to question him for 5 to 6 hours and then walk out with nearly $60K worth of property, mostly electronics, laptops, and phones. He thought he was in the clear, and then 2 months later, agents returned with a target letter imploring him to speak with the U.S. Attorney Office. They said that they had enough evidence to convict him of his client's fraud. So it was not his fraud. He was selling Bitcoins peer-to-peer, and his client was using it for a scam. They said that they had enough to convict him of his client's fraud. And since him and his wife had a shared bank account, him and his wife would both serve 35 years in prison. He was saying that this basically was a scare tactic to scare both him and his wife because they have young children. Texas and other states are pushing for Bitcoin adoption, which we think is a great thing here at this show, and we think it's awesome that more states are advocating for this. But I'm just saying this as to add some nuance. They're literally manufacturing felons in the process, and those are kind of his words. What I mean by this is a lot of states have self-sovereignty, but there's different state and local laws versus federal laws. This is something that we saw back actually in 2015, 2016, 2017. A lot of federal agencies were going after people that would grow marijuana in Colorado or California, where there would be legal laws for them to do so, and they'd either get licensed by the state, but since it was illegal federally, they were hitting them up with RICO charges, which is basically money laundering charges. And these were charges that they actually used back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to go after mainly just gangs and crime syndicates, whether it was the Italian mob or Russian mob. It was a way that basically the U.S. government or the federal government was able to go after people for when they couldn't catch them for other crimes that they were committing. So why is this important? So the feds at several points along the way advised him that even though he was fully registered as a Bitcoin seller with a FinCEN paying lawyer to get compliant in November, they did not consider his OTC operation to be legal. Why? Because federal guidelines advise to get state-level licensing as a money services business. If you check with most states, though, state-level guidelines, simply engaging in P2P activities or peer-to-peer activities does not rise or requiring a license, and thus they won't grant you one. According to research conducted by Blockchain Law Center, the frequency at which nobodies like me, referring to Rizn, are being persecuted under this law in an increasing year-over-year rate. The DOJ actually holds clinics on how to apply this law more liberally to people. In his final statements and in his final tweet, he says, "We need to keep in mind that the state is constructing felonies for us, and the blockchain has a long memory. We need to advocate for a sensible government as well as our fellow fallen cypherpunks. This is the then they fight you stage." So guys, I don't know what your thoughts on that. I know it's kind of deep and heavy article talking about a guy just selling Bitcoin peer-to-peer and ultimately getting captured by the state in a way. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think you did a great job of summing it up, man. This is super fucked up. And we're going to start to see more situations like this where people are being unfairly prosecuted for their involvement with Bitcoin and systems, that use it.
I'm going to also just, piggyback off of that and bring up another story that I saw in No Bullshit Bitcoin about how the Australian Federal Bank has essentially created and approved a cryptocurrency, or federal police, sorry, formed a cryptocurrency unit focused on tracking and seizing crypto funds under the guise of national security, child protection, and cybersecurity. This reads a lot, in my opinion, like the Patriot Act, or, you know what, I'll even go so far as to say it's like the Inflation Reduction Act. It's just they label this name on it and they get to decide which category it falls under and if the work that you're doing is deemed good or bad. And we're starting to see this slowly and steadily happen all across developed democracies. This is not happening in dictatorship like countries. This is a democracy down in Australia, or was at one point a democracy down in Australia. And we know the horrors and the way that they've treated their citizens pretty much since COVID. We saw it in Canada when citizens who did something that the prime minister didn't agree with, and then they had retributions in the form of bank accounts getting shut down and so on and so forth. Now you're having it just a simple transaction. You want to take this down to first principles. This is no different than two kids trading Pokemon cards. And it just so happens that one of the kids that's trading the Pokemon cards just so happens to be doing it in an underground, illegal, whatever. Like, so therefore you are now affiliated with that. This is a very, very scary precedent that is being set before our eyes. And regardless of if you're a Bitcoiner or not, you should be concerned about this. The loss of freedoms and rights for any group, regardless of if you agree with those rights, regardless of if you agree with those people and what they stand for, is wrong at the end of the day, because it can very quickly get switched to you. And if you celebrate things like this, it's only a matter of time until the hammer comes down on you and the things that you believe with. But I'm ranting and rambling. I'm going to switch to some positive news, unless either of you guys have anything more to share. Great. So the HRF and dear friend Alex Gladstein has announced that they are going to donate $325,000 in Bitcoin for Bitcoin development. This ranging from $100,000 going straight to BTC Pay Server, 2 donations of $50,000 each to different core developers, $25,000 donation to Keith Mukai, a friend of mine, friend of the show. Shout out Keith for his work over at Seed Signer. And countless others. Lee Quen, who has written for Bitcoin Magazine as well. RoboSats, Novaya Gazeta, Venetum Initiative. I believe that covers all of the $325,000. I just wanted to highlight that the HRF has now donated over $1.5 million in Bitcoin and USD over the last 2 years to further Bitcoin development across the world, and will announce its next round of donations in January 2025. Thank you to the HRF for the work that they do to continue to push Bitcoin forward. We are all very grateful for it and stand to benefit from the work and choices that you guys make.
Yeah, this is huge. I'm super excited.
Yeah, I'm really excited for, all of these projects are great. RoboSat's one that I've used personally. And also Keith Mukai, like you said, friend of the show. He was actually running out of funding or getting very close to running out of funding. So this will help further his development of free and open source software. I know we talk about in this space that it's very, Bitcoin's meant peer-to-peer, but a lot of these projects are free and open source. So it's very tough for these people that have normally day jobs and then do this in their free time at night or evenings or early mornings. Keith Mukai is one of the better ones in the space, and he's done a lot for the Seed Signer project and helping people just get hardware devices at a cheaper price point, as well as, don't trust, verify ethos of basically building your own hardware signing device. And it's very, very awesome. I think this is going to be great for the developing world that can't afford a cold card, a Trezor, a Ledger, you name it. So this is awesome.
Awesome. Let's go over to the mining pools and another rug pull.
Yep. So the 5th largest Bitcoin mining pool in the world has rugged its customers. Specifically, pool and operators have announced 0 fees for all users from September 8th to December 7th, and a change from the FPPS to PPLNS for Bitcoin payout calculations. They also plan to extend the zero fee period to a full year for miners who choose to hold a larger balance, more than 1 Bitcoin or 5 ETH, on their custodial wallet. Now, why are they doing this? They're doing this because they are desperate to incentivize miners to stay with them even as they are insolvent and unable to make ends meet. So they said the payout of the current BTC and ETH balances on the pool will be temporarily suspended. They're going to take a snapshot of the remaining Bitcoin and ETH balances on the pool on September 6th to work out those balances. Then the daily mined coins after September 6th will be normally paid out per day. They're saying that other coins are not affected. The details of the payout schedule for remaining balances will be released when those details are set. So this comes just a day after admitting to having liquidity issues. They have paused all withdrawals from their wallet service. This is significant because they currently have 10.3% of the world's global Bitcoin hash rate. Yeah, this is an interesting moment in time. What do you guys think?
I think we're slowly and steadily seeing the collapse of over-leveraged businesses in the Bitcoin ecosystem. I'm not saying that I've read through enough of Poolin's data and earnings reports, financial files to like make such an aggressive claim. Technically, since we are a media outlet, I should probably retract that boldness so we don't get sued for libel. But that's what this reads like. And that's what every situation like this has been. So I am drawing a conclusion and an assumption here, but I do think we are starting to see the separation of well-run businesses and poorly run businesses. No different than any industry that is dealing with this in the midst of the world's largest global recession since 2007. I would argue so much to say since way back when. But we don't want to use the D word, depression, which we are in. Sorry, did I just say that? Look, ultimately, you can go to any industry and see situations like this, not literally saying, oh, customer funds are getting shut down, but businesses are closing down, different departments are getting shut down. This just reads like a mismanaged company. For the sake of the people who use Poolin, I really hope that this gets resolved quickly and that everyone's able to get their funds released to them. But yet another reminder of the importance of self-custody.
Yeah, I narrowed it down to 4 things that I think it could be. So either they're having liquidity issues from messing with other cryptocurrencies, and I know they were mentioning ETH, so that could be an issue. ETH has fallen probably in lockstep with Bitcoin. I didn't know if they're messing with any other altcoins. They're getting margin called on their loans for their mining and operations. They have variable pricing rates as energy prices are skyrocketing in Europe instead of fixed rates or long-term deals, or they were hacked. So those are kind of the 4 things that I put it in that they're having issues with. I think it's kind of along the lines of basically getting margin called on, like taking out loans against their miners in order to expand their operations. With that being said, I mean, even if 10% of the global hash rate were to go offline, we saw about 50% of it go offline when China did a hard banning of Bitcoin miners in April of last year. So what's 10% compared to 50? It's much smaller. Obviously, I think this maybe hampers the price in the short term. Obviously, the hash rate's going to come down. But yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting. Also, I want to pull up Nunya Business. Also talked that it has fallen about 5%. I checked earlier this morning. It was still at 10.3. I know it was closer to 11 this weekend when I was looking. But yeah, it's definitely falling in hash rate. And I expect many of the miners to be like, if I'm not getting my Bitcoin, I'm going to direct it to a different pool. I know Slush Pool is kind of more of, I'd say the pleb-friendly pool is what I call it. But do your own research, do your own due diligence.
I'm pretty sure all I know is Bitcoin is now at $19,100. So I think that people are referencing the price, but do be aware we are in the midst of yet another Bitcoin crash because, Bitcoin's dead. I don't know. This is the most living dead thing I've ever seen in my life, but what do I know? Let's go to war. And no, I'm not talking Game of Thrones, nor am I talking Lord of the Rings. I'm talking stable coins. Chris, what is going on?
Yeah, you're not even talking about the war on Russia and Ukraine either.
Or the war on drugs, which
the war
by
on
the way,
drugs.
Drugs won. Drugs won the war on drugs.
I would agree. So Binance is to remove USDC as a tradable asset on its platform beginning September 29th, 2022. So that is only a few weeks away. It will convert all USDC, USDP, and TUSD into Binance USD at this time. One of the things that I noted, so they have a long press release of what happens if you're staking, what happens if you're just having it in the account, what happens if all these various things. We are not a stablecoin show. We are a Bitcoin only show, but it is crazy when one of the largest exchanges in the world is basically saying that you can only use their stablecoin going forward. So one of the notes that I saw is what will happen if my USDC loan is collateralized? So it said all loan orders with USDC as a borrowable asset or collateral asset will be closed on 9/23. So this is about 6 days before they begin the whole transfer over. Remaining USD balance will be returned to your spot wallet. Obviously, what that means, though, is if you're getting your loan closed, you most likely are getting margin called in a couple of weeks. So not financial advice, not tax advice, but if you have a large loan open with Binance right now, it is not good to be in that position. You probably want to close that out sooner rather than later. They said that they will be converting all USDC and into BUSD at a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning that they'll convert them 1-to-1. It's very, very interesting, though. We're calling this the stablecoin wars, and remains to be seen what happens. I think a lot of these companies want to have to vie and say like, hey, we're the best stablecoin. And I think the end goal of all altcoins and or stablecoins is to basically get co-opted by a government and say, we're going to use this as the new central bank digital currency. I just think that's the end game. I don't think any of them can compete with Bitcoin on the long term. Yet maybe knock on wood, or I don't know, maybe one of them flips Bitcoin. I don't think that's ever going to happen in market cap, but remains to be seen. It could, in theory. What are your thoughts? Anything you guys want to add there? The craziness over at Binance.
Yeah, it's fucking wild.
The only thing I will comment on is CZ might have won Twitter for like a 5-minute window yesterday when he replied to Elon Musk's tweet, where Elon was going on about like bitching about Lord of the Rings, which like, honestly, Lord of the Rings for 2 episodes has been solid. I will continue to watch. And in his thread, he takes a screenshot of all the bots that responded to him. And they're all the CZ bots that like Bitcoin Magazine gets also. And then CZ, the real CZ, replies under it saying like, oh yeah, I something to the tune of like, oh yeah, you're right. Like these are all fake. And then Samson Mao just dunks on CZ going, you should have said, how is no one talking about this? Because that's what all the bots are saying. Oh, sometimes Twitter is fucking great. Other times it's not really, but I don't know. I digress. It's Tuesday, but it's really a Monday. Russia. So this is a continuation of what we talked about last week, where Iran had announced that they're going to accept cryptocurrency payments for foreign trades. Well, turns out Russia is now going to follow suit, saying that they're going to legalize the use of Bitcoin and crypto in international trade. What do Russia and Iran have in common? Well, the big bad United States of America has put both of those countries under sanctions. Now, all of a sudden, an opportunity has presented itself for them to trade on the global markets with their surplus of oil and gas that both countries have and the rest of the world needs. So this will be very interesting. I do think we will start to see more and more trades with these countries fulfilled in Bitcoin and potentially other cryptocurrencies as well. But that's besides the point. What will be interesting is how this will get framed in Western countries, because as we said last week, Bitcoin is for enemies. There's been no bigger enemy per trade to Western countries than Vladimir Putin and Russia over the last 6-7 months, nor has Iran been exactly considered a friend or an ally over the last 50 years. This will strengthen. The FUD around Bitcoin is only used by illegal or bad governments. But I also think this is an opportunity for said bad governments to grow and have their nations prosper in a time when the US dollar is about to collapse. So I digress. This is my mini rant. You know how I feel about these sanctions, and this is an excellent move by Russia, regardless of all their other political moves and things they do.
Indeed. On to our next story. So the cold storage and Bitcoin privacy platforms are teaming up. Specifically, Trezor and Wasabi Wallet have joined forces in an attempt to make Bitcoin more private. According to them, users will be able to coin join using Wasabi on their Trezor devices for greater transaction privacy beginning next year. Now, I'm of several minds about this. On the one hand, I think it is very positive that Trezor is attempting to kind of follow in the footsteps of the incredible desktop wallets like Sparrow wallet. Now, also, obviously Trezor manufactures a hardware wallet, which is one of the first well-established hardware devices that are out there. They're still used all over the world. They are reliable and they get the job done. However, I have personal issues with the way that Wasabi Wallet does its sort of fee structure. They work directly with Chainalysis companies in order to have the ability to potentially censor transactions that are not OFAC compliant and things like that, which to me is kind of anathema to how I think about Bitcoin. But my takeaway here is that this is a positive thing overall because it is a very large hardware wallet manufacturer integrating directly with a tool that that I would say is a step in the right direction in terms of privacy preserving technologies. So I love to see tools like Wasabi being brought more into the mainstream because, as I say so often on the show, privacy is a human right. It is not something that you should have to justify, nor is it something that somebody should be able to tell you, like, if you don't have anything to hide, don't worry about it. So the more we can normalize privacy preserving technologies, the better off we are. But what do you guys think?
I'm muted. No. Yeah. No.
No,
Okay.
you're
Cool.
good.
I mean, regardless of what app you use, I think sometimes people get caught up with this idea of, oh, well, you shouldn't use that or you shouldn't use that, and then people get overwhelmed and too afraid. Like if your cold storage path goes through Wasabi and Trezor, amazing, great, excellent. If it doesn't, amazing, great, excellent. I think people just need to take more time to understand what real safety and security of their Bitcoin means. A lot of you took the time to learn about money to go down this rabbit hole. And now I think the next rabbit hole for many people, myself included, to explore is the actual safety and security of this. So that's my big thing, my 2 cents. Like whether you use Sparrow, whether you use Wasabi, whether you use Trezor, Cold Card, Ledger, whatever you use, like, to be honest, any of those things are infinitely better, in my opinion, than leaving your Bitcoin on Coinbase. So that's sort of where I'm coming from on this. So don't necessarily make people feel bad for using Wasabi or Trezor, because ultimately that's a lot better than them using or leaving their Bitcoin on Cash App or leaving their Bitcoin on Strike. It's a step. So they still have many more steps to go.
Yeah, I still maintain the best solution. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No, go ahead, P. I interrupted you. Go ahead.
I was going to say that I still maintain the best solution is the one that I came up with, which is by land, by sea, and by air. A 2 of 3 multi-sig where you take your hardware devices, ideally with different manufacturers, and you attach one to something like a cheetah, one to something like a golden eagle, and then one to something like a blue whale. Now, if you have earned the right to access your Bitcoin in the future, those animals will return to you, and you will have access to your funds. And if not, then you had it coming.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. I think that is an excellent multi-sig setup, P. So I need to strive to get there. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So I did personally, I guess I'll caveat this. There's trade-offs to every one of these platforms, whether it's Join Market, Wasabi, or Whirlpool. I want you to do your own research, but there are trade-offs to it. I personally do not use Wasabi. I don't agree that some of the fees that go for doing your coin join go to paying a chain analysis firm. Whirlpool, I will say Wasabi is a better platform, but it's trade-off that you're supporting chain analysis. So that's kind of the trade-off. Whirlpool, I would say also the problem with them is it's only 5 inputs in and 5 inputs out. If you're doing it from a probability standpoint, it's a 1 in 5 chance of them getting you or saying which one of your UTXOs. One of the problems too, we've brought this up at our meetup, is technically that's the most easy for a government to co-opt because you only pay the fee once and then you can be in rounds for forever as long as you want. If you are coin joining and then the 4 other inputs are the US government or some government, they know that your input and your output, because they're the 4 inputs and the 4 other outputs. Join markets, talking about the Sybil attack. And then join market is probably the most robust, but people have lost many of their Bitcoins by doing it because it's command line based. So there's trade-offs to each of these. Wasabi and Whirlpool are definitely easier to use. Join market is probably more robust and there's less Sybil or middle in the man attacks. Wasabi supports chain analysis, so there's kind of things that you have to weigh and kind of do your own thing. I hope actually more CoinJoin implementations come out and compete in the free and open market, just instead of just the main 3 ones that we have. Using Bitcoin peer-to-peer is always the best way, getting it on non-KYC exchange. Obviously, we had that story talk about potential risk of selling Bitcoin in a peer-to-peer fashion, but it is an option. So, moving on.
Good stuff.
All right. We're going to cut to a quick commercial break at this point, and we're going to be joined by Dylan LeClair. But before we do that, I want to remind everyone that tickets to Bitcoin Amsterdam are on sale. Ticket prices go up this week, so lock in your tickets now and use promo code BMLive to get 10% off of that. We'll be back after this commercial break.
You are listening to Bitcoin Magazine Live. Listening to Bitcoin Magazine Live. Number 1 Bitcoin Magazine Live. You are listening to Bitcoin Magazine Live. Listening to Bitcoin Magazine Live. Number 1 Bitcoin Magazine Live. Samba.
Q, you are muted, my friend.
That sucks. I'm just going to pick up right where I left off. I'm excited to introduce our guest for today, none other than market analyst or lead market analyst. Dylan, I forget what your title is. I'm so
Future
sorry,
person.
man.
Something like that, man.
all I know is truly one of the smartest people on Bitcoin Twitter, someone who I look to for a lot of understanding on how he's seeing and reading cloud world and how that pertains to just the global markets. Dylan, how are you doing, man?
Doing great. Excited to be back after a long weekend. Went to the U.S. Open, which was good fun. But back in the saddle and watching the global economy slow gradually then suddenly implode, and it's exciting times at the very least. Happy to be here.
If you're not familiar with Dylan and his work on Bitcoin Magazine Pro, please go over and subscribe to Bitcoin Magazine Pro now. We've spent some time discussing on Bitcoin Magazine Pro the ongoing energy debacle over in Europe, which I'm assuming, Dylan, is what you were alluding to when you're saying slow, gradually, and then suddenly the whole world is going to just collapse. Let's talk Europe. We were going to share a story out of the UK just before you joined us, and that is the new prime minister just, hitting the ground running and is going to print 130 billion pounds in order to try and freeze UK power bills. We kind of know how this story works, but for those who maybe aren't as well versed, Dylan, do you mind walking us through when you hear or see something like that? How does that relate back now to what your expectations are with oil and gas prices in Europe, as well as what could happen with the pound?
Yeah, I mean, you've seen a kind of a geopolitical risk premium in energy prices, but specifically European energy prices since Since the Putin invasion, and honestly before that, as some people could kind of see supply constraints coming, with forward European gas prices. But essentially, the entire eurozone is old. Demographics are terrible. They're up to their eyeballs in debt in relative terms, and they're kind of all constrained in this kind of European currency block where it's like you have a bunch of different sovereigns all under one monetary union. It's much harder from a fiscal perspective to kind of make policy with variable demographics across that block, which is kind of an important part of this whole debacle. And so now, with Putin and his escalation and military escalation into Ukraine, what's essentially happened is that the Western countries are sanctioning Russia, and Russia's sanctioning them back, and basically calling their bluff in energy terms. So now Europe has a massive energy deficit, and the surge in prices is allowing them, or forcing them rather, to go into other global markets, whether that's from the U.S. or buying a lot of this energy and gas, oil and gas, back from a higher price from China, who's simply just buying it from Russia. It's quite absurd, honestly, but in somewhat a virtue signaling manner. But this essentially, estimates now are coming in for the rest of 2022. Over the next year, this is going to have a 15%. The energy surge is going to cost Europe 15% of its GDP. And so, if you know anything about modern credit-based economies, especially in this debt environment for fiat currencies, this surge in inflation and reversal of 20, 30 years of disinflationary conditions built upon globalization and kind of a unipolar world order where everybody was harmonizing in unison. That's maybe not completely different today, but it's all reversing quite rapidly, and kind of the lines are being drawn geopolitically. China, Russia, the United States, Taiwan, all these players in the back that are kind of implementing protectionist trade policies and restocking their military. There's obviously a clear escalation point coming, and none of it over the short to intermediate term is good for risk assets, because you have yields soaring in bond markets. Bonds are selling off, the biggest market in the world. Stocks are selling off in tandem because of an earnings recession, and at the same time you have again Europe and the UK coming in and trying to paper it over with more stimulus and more spending, while yields are screaming higher. It's ultimately going to lead to, over the long term, the complete meltdown of all fiat currencies in real terms, and the dollar will kind of be that last domino. But over the short term, it's a really scary situation for everyone in Europe. It's going to be very costly, and I think it's probably going to get a little bit worse before we can start to work on solutions, and it gets better. Kind of a long answer there.
No, it was excellent though, and I'm curious too, like to couple this story with another story that I think relates. We're seeing now, as of yesterday and last week, Iran, yesterday, Russia announced that they're going to accept cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin being the main one that both countries have already started to use as a form of international trade settlement. Both countries are famously under sanctions, can't really transact with US dollars. Do you think that how important or how significant is something like that? Like, do you think it's in the realm of possibilities for a European country to step away from the sort of European central bank and say, we will pay you in Bitcoin, we'll pay you in rupees because like our citizens need warmth, our citizens need gas, or is your expectations based on what you've learned about the European Central Bank and the Eurozone, there won't really be a break or a change from them only wanting to stick to the petrodollar system?
Yeah, I think it's important to just recognize that this is all kind of devolving from just a unipolar world order, a dollar standard, right? Global energy trade has been conducted in dollars for the last 50 years, and really going back to Bretton Woods, 1944, where that dollar became that world settlement unit. And so the fact that Russia's even saying, pay me in rubles or maybe euros, which will convert into gold or other kind of base assets. Like Putin has said this over the last decade. He says, the U.S. basically robs the world by exporting its inflation, exporting its dollars. The dollar's artificially strong, and people that produce real goods, real stuff, get screwed over. And by people, I mean sovereigns like Russia, commodity exporters. Russia's the biggest commodity exporter in the world. So what do you do as an energy exporter or a commodities exporter? You're sending goods and services to the rest of the world. Well, that means you have a surplus, an economic surplus. And, traditionally, if say the world is on a gold standard, and we never saw a globalized world, at an international economy at today's scale, or even 50 years back on a total gold standard. So that would, and it's because gold's very hard to move right across space. But going back to that, you have to store your economic surplus in something. And for the last 70 years, but really the last, the golden years of globalization, say 1990 to today, or maybe 2015, or whatever that peak was, maybe COVID. That economic surplus was stored in G7 liabilities. And what I mean by that, it's basically the sovereign reserves, sovereign debt of Eurozone countries, Germany, the United States, Treasury market being obviously the largest. You were holding your claims in sovereign G7, debt, right? It's an IOU and it's a promise of future repayment. But what's that payment worth in a world where right now we see the Bank of Japan saying we're going to buy any 10-year bond over 2.5%, we're going to buy it. So as rates go up, as the bond prices go down, we're just going to buy it and basically print more bank reserves. We're just going to suppress the cost of debt. And so that's what they're doing. They're doing that already. The ECB is hawkish apparently, because they're moving yields from 0% today to probably 75 basis points in the next, I think, month or so. Maybe it's this week. I should know this, but they just barely raised rates from negative, right? So, and they're they're basically walking into a sovereign debt crisis because all these governments, their citizens are going to revolt. It's already starting. You're seeing social unrest and quells everywhere already, and the people and the populace, the people think it's the politicians, in the same way that us watching in the U.S. Let's go, Brandon, like whatever your thoughts are on local domestic politics. But people go to the pump, people go to the grocery store, and they're mad at someone, and they're mad at the person whose supposed responsibility it is. And that's the incumbent political party. So both sides on the right and the left, the politicians, like this is the same thing we've seen in previous kind of 80-year cycles of history. When the previous two world wars, specifically like in the 30s, when you saw all of the kind of the fascist leaders arise around the world. Well, there was a reason that all those leaders became politically palatable, right? It was the Overton window shifted, and the populace demanded radical change in the form of whatever government, right or left. And so they're not going to people aren't going to sit around and as they starve or freeze this winter in Europe in a particular country, and that's obviously a little hyperbolic, but at the margin, if price is 5x, which they have, then the inputs of so many things in CPI, year-over-year inflation in Europe might hit 10, 12, 15, hell, even 20%. You're seeing German PPI at 30%. These things aren't politically palatable, and it's gonna lead to a lot of political promises and basically more debt to be issued by the ECB and those sovereigns, or not by the ECB, by those local sovereign governments. And so that's going to be in a debt market that's already selling off because of huge inflation, and it's going to force the ECB to come in and backstop the whole thing again. Particularly, you're seeing those four the pigs in Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain are already so weak and up to their eyeballs in debt that there's almost no option other than to kind of continue to just implement financial monetary repression and be a buyer. Essentially, it's yield curve control, but they're doing it across 15 countries, which makes it all the more challenging. So, I mean, it's a really bad situation. It's one of the, I'm a student of markets, and I haven't sat in the chair for a long time, but this is a lot of smart people that I follow and I respect, and I read their work. Are saying this is one of the worst situations we've ever seen. So it's certainly going to be an interesting 6 to 12 months.
Before people tell me I'm muted, I needed to make sure I wasn't. I love that you're drawing from history to sort of help you better understand and see what's going on here. Are there other clues from how we went from that transitionary period after World War II that are some warning signs, some cautionary things to be concerned about if they were to pop up present day in whatever form of variation that would look like in 2022 or so on?
So to be honest, I was just looking at something I spaced out for the first half of the question, but I think if you want to repeat it again, just shortly, that help.
More or less, are there other things historically that are like, hey, that would be a really bad thing? Like this would be terrible if this happened in 2022, or if something similar in this vein that happened historically happened again. What are those type of events that you're concerned about?
Global energy crisis, we've seen debt bubbles, we've seen whether that's housing or subprime or tech or venture capital, and I've referred to 2021 as the everything bubble. Since since the start of 2021, and going into it when the central banks went crazy post COVID, Bitcoin included, right? It was obviously included in that basket of everything just melting up as a result of free money. And so now we're seeing this kind of unwind, and we're seeing a check on that everything bubble of this, basically hyperinflated asset bubble from stocks to bonds, right? You had bond yields below 1% at one point in the United States, the cost of capital for the world, right? On a 30-year basis, like it was peak madness, and it was certainly kind of illogical from a credit market perspective. And so as that bond bubble has deflated, right, what you're seeing is everything else. The most liquid market in the world is selling off. It's puking trillions up a day. So when Bitcoin is 800 billion, right, it's like it's just too small at this point to decouple from just the magnitude and the size of these things that are coming down the pipe, and that's fine. Like that's all the opportunity in the world for the sat stackers today. But from a financial system perspective, you certainly saw all that kind of hidden leverage in the Bitcoin market. We knew about the kind of transparent leverage for a while, and we talk about it on Bitcoin Magazine Pro all the time. We talk about the perpetual swap markets and the funding rates, and these are essentially like it's native cost of capital in Bitcoin terms, demand for leverage, demand for debt, right? It's like that's the rise of DeFi. You kind of saw like this variable crypto native interest rate for both yields and borrowing, for lending and borrowing, and that was the same thing in the transparent Bitcoin futures markets. Is that you saw this variable interest rate to be long or short, and that interest rate for the perpetual futures contract ties its price to the actual spot trading price. You're trading $1 of fiat for $1 of Bitcoin, or right? That's happening every second, 1,000 times a second. Obviously more than that. But the futures market, there's quarterly futures. So for say December of 2023, I don't think there's a contract for that. There isn't. But for December 2022, there's Bitcoin futures, and there's a price. And right now it's actually probably a little bit below today's spot price. People are hedging out risk. But we saw all of that transparent leverage all get flushed for the most part, and to kind of back to neutral territory. But we didn't know was the Celsius, the three eras capital of the world, that hidden leverage also all got purged for the most part. Now we're seeing really the stressors on the mining industry. We saw Poolin yesterday. Poolin was essentially assuming the risk of their pool, and mining is all probabilistic, and it's ultimately luck. You're just flipping the coin, but it's not really flipping a coin. It's obviously hashing a block. But I think they were assuming that risk, and it looks like they're insolvent. And they say they're not, but that's what every insolvent company ever says when they say, decide to pause withdrawals for, liquidity purposes. So you're seeing Poolin, you're seeing other kind of miners, right? Where I think about at 17K will be at the lowest hash price ever. So hash price is miner revenue divided by hash rate. What does that mean? It means miners' margins are continuing to squeeze. So we're going to see more selling pressure from miners during this. It's a natural cleansing of everything, right? But risk is selling off around the world, and credit risk is rapidly becoming real in legacy markets. Volatility is picking up, and so we're gonna we've seen it in kind of bursts in 2022, but we're probably headed for some global margin call type moment, and in that scenario. Bitcoin is just, it's just not going to get bid. It's not going to decouple just yet. Like we're not in that world. It's okay to recognize it. it's much more volatile, and it's tied to global risk flows. And Bitcoin would decouple if there was meaningful, huge spot buyers coming in, new money coming in. For the most part, money is not coming in this ecosystem at the moment, and that's fine. I mean, I understand plebs are stacking. I even stack just a little bit, passively on the hour, but it's not not a material part of my income. I'm actually just keeping getting a growing cash hoard to buy blood here. It's more of just kind of a tribute, stacking a little bit of sats every day. But the reality is there's no one is coming in with huge, massive size. I know the BlackRock thing happened and was announced at the local top this summer. But I think no one's coming in with huge size during this. No rich European or even the United States at this point, when equity markets are selling off, bond markets are selling off, volatility spiking, dollars, like the foreign currencies are crashing against the dollar, basically every single one of them. No one's going to be stepping in with huge size and buying Bitcoin, right? So like that's the reason to be like short-term bearish. And if you're long-term bullish on Bitcoin, that's great, because your dollars, like there's a decent chance, it's a non-zero chance that your dollars could still appreciate in Bitcoin terms 50% from here, 100% from here. Like those are not 100%, but if Bitcoin's price goes down by 50%, you can buy twice as much of it. And so like these are things that could definitely happen. If Bitcoin falls 25%, you get 50% more Bitcoin. And so like I think it's just it's okay to recognize that as a long-term convicted Bitcoiner. Like Bitcoin is not a risk-off asset just yet. It's just not. And so that's okay. If things are going to get, like, no one's in Europe's going to be buying Bitcoin when there's, they can't afford to heat their house. That's okay. But what's important to contextualize with all of this, and why we even talk about, foreign currencies and bonds, or a Bitcoin newsletter, why the hell are we talking about bonds and volatility and all this legacy finance stuff? Well, I mean, we just like to quantify the monetization process of this thing. And it's still in the phase where it can, I mean, the market's telling us that. It's still in the phase where it can go down 80, 85%, 90% from the highs, which a lot of people in 2020 and 2021, myself included for a bit, said, this time's different, hyper-Bitcoinization. Like I was wrong on the timing early in the spring of 2021. But we're just not in that world. And so when this thing unwinds, which it's unwinding, the whole global financial economic system, the response at the end of it is going to be just a massive, and I think really the Fed matters. The ECB and BOJ can print, but if the Fed's not accommodative, if the Fed isn't bailing out the global dollar shortage, and the U.S. government doesn't spray a bunch of funny money again, that's really monetary policy for the world. And so on the other side of that, it's going to be just, they're gonna have to reinflate the whole bubble again. They're gonna have to print their eyeballs out. But until that moment comes, I think it's gonna be tough for a lot of risk.
So there's something interesting that you said, and P, I'd love your guidance and perspective here, because I will age Dylan and myself in saying that we haven't been around nearly as long through as many cycles as you have. And you kind of hear these stories of like, oh, like this bear market's different because you have more companies now still getting involved, talking about Bitcoin. I'm still of the mindset of, from 2018 to 2019, you didn't hear mainstream media like CNBC on a daily basis talk about Bitcoin, whereas now you do. And while like Dylan, I was laughing so hard at the BlackRock coming in at the local top with their latest partnership with Coinbase. And like, I remember reading those stories about, I believe it was Fidelity in 2017. Like they released their market product at the local top at that moment in time. And then all of a sudden, like everything went down. They closed these offerings down though previously. And this iteration, we're actually seeing businesses want to try to stay here. So P, my question to you is like, does this feel different? Does the environment actually feel like we're setting ourselves up? Or is this another cycle where inevitably we're in a bear market? People aren't going to be going in. People aren't necessarily going to be investing in Bitcoin or the ecosystem pretty much until, as the old trading saying goes, like, what have you done for me recently? Like until Bitcoin starts going up for investors.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. We talked about this recently. I it does feel like we're in a very different situation. In large part because of the larger macroeconomic environment. Everybody is really looking to figure out, like, okay, where do I maintain my value in a way that that was not happening in the last bear market in Bitcoin. Um, I, you know, I think that, as we talked about as well, Bitcoin is undeniable now. To what you were just saying, like BlackRock did, announce this partnership at the top. At the same time, there are new news stories every single day about major banks, major entities continuing to very publicly get involved in Bitcoin, and we just didn't see that, to my knowledge, as much in the last cycle. So I do think this is different. I think that people are turning more and more to Bitcoin, even as we are in this very, dark-looking global macroeconomic environment, because they're starting to understand the importance of it, even despite the recent declines in price. So the short version is, I have no idea what the fuck's going to happen next. It does feel different than the previous cycles, because Bitcoin feels way more undeniable. People are still talking about it, and it'll be interesting to see how it continues to play out.
Dylan, let's talk domestically.
Wait, I actually do have one question. Sorry, that's related to that.
Oh my God, P's alive.
Normally, I just sort of sit quietly and absorb the considerable knowledge during these types of conversations. But how does the on-chain environment look different than where we are in the cycle in last cycle's bear market? Have you looked into that at all, Dylan? Like, what is the on-chain data showing us?
Yeah. So we still talk about the on-chain side of things. I think just from like when we're talking about like a price prediction standpoint, I think it's still on a at the margin, prices decided at the margin. It's still Bitcoin and a lot of these supply metrics we look at, right? And we talk about this. Supply held for 1 year. It's I think it's flirting still with highs. Maybe it's come down a bit. I haven't checked in the recent week. But it's like 60% of Bitcoin haven't moved in a year, right? But that, Bitcoin, the supply inelasticity of it, the absolute scarcity of it, and the hodler mentality is great in bull markets, because it just takes just a small tap of money, right? And the supply and elasticity, right? Sellers are exhausted, right? After you puke the lows, after Bitcoin during 2020 goes from 10,000, everybody's, it's moon season, lever long, the halving is coming up, what happens next? And then COVID happens, Black Swan, all this leverage completely unwinds, forced selling, capitulation. There were, Bitcoin and BitMEX drove the price down 55% in a day. And what happened after that was basically there was no sellers left. Obviously, there was the tailwind of a ton of money, but there was no sellers. So what we can see with on-chain, specifically with something like realized price, where we can see the average cost basis of every Bitcoin on the network. It went from about 4K in 2020. So the average Bitcoin on chain, the cost basis, the realized price, swapped hands at 4K. And that was basically, I think it got to $3,500 at the absolute top in 2017, December 14th or whatever it was, 2017. I think it was maybe the 18th, the 20K top briefly. The average Bitcoin had only traded hands at like $3,500. Over the next 3 years, despite Bitcoin drawing down 85%, chopping around, getting to 12K in the summer of 2019, the average cost basis only really rose to 4,000. And then COVID happened, it puked. But from there, a hot ball of money came in, tried to move the thing, and all the willing sellers were gone. And so you saw that average cost basis with all the money that was chucked at Bitcoin, it went from 4K to 24K at the top of I think it was like November of this year. At the absolute top, it just kept rising. Old coins were getting found in stashes, switched to new hands in the bull market. New money was coming in. Since then, we've seen a massive capitulation in price. Bitcoin's down 85%, and that cost basis, I believe off the top of my head, and I can actually look from 24. I think it's around $20,000. It was at 21, and it keeps going lower as on the reverse side of things, you see during bull markets, realized price goes up, coins are changing hands at a profit. In a bear market, you see basically any 2021 at 19K, anyone in 2021, and really anyone in 2020 except for a week or so is underwater, right? So you're seeing realized price go down in a pretty meaningful way. Let me try to find this stat for you. Right now, the realized price is 21,500. So Bitcoin's at 9K, any Bitcoin at 19K, and that realized price is coming down because there's some capitulation. So I think it still matters, and it still gives you a really solid framework. When Bitcoin's under its cost basis, it's like typically peak bear market, right? Throughout the past cycles, it's like a fantastic opportunity to buy. But from what Sam and I have done with our analysis, it can still drop 50% below that, right? It can still, and it's done that. I think it's dropped 40% below its average cost basis in the previous bear market. So like, yeah, the average cost basis was 4K, but it went to 3.5, right? So like there was some pain. Right now it's 19. It can go a lot lower, but we're still seeing that on-chain kind of capitulation play out. I think we're going to see some minor capitulation on-chain play out. As you get that hash price, that miner revenue divided by hash rate, that miner profitability margin kind of estimate. It's just a solid metric to look at across all miners in the space. It just looks at hash rate as a whole. You're going to see some capitulation there. And so these are the things that we like to watch with on-chain. But I think at the margin, it's still going to trade basically, if you look at a 30-second chart at any point, it's going to trade relative to global risk, to equities, to bonds, to all these things as it's more intertwined.
I want to shift it to domestic debt now, if I can, P.
Absolutely, go for it.
Okay, cool. So we have a Fed meeting in about 2 weeks. I know, Dylan, we also touched on at the beginning. The ECB has their sort of rate hike meeting, I believe, next week or this week. As the year's kind of winding down, we saw at the beginning of the year what the expectations were. We're starting to see how those very much are not going to be the case. Expectations including what all these different central banks thought inflation would be at, where they expected or thought that interest rates would be at. And we're starting to see their plans blow up before their very eyes. If you'll entertain me for a moment, I want to give you the right to make decisions as though you are Jerome Powell. What are you doing in 2 weeks at the Fed meeting?
I think the markets just told them they're going to hike. They have to hike. There's still a huge spread between, and the domestic economy doesn't look that bad. U.S. consumers are still spending. The kind of the fall in energy prices recently has helped that. And I think relatively the U.S. consumer and economy is in way better shape compared to anyone as a whole. But it's still, I still think we're headed for a recession. We see a lot of things turn over, like starting to turn over, like housing. And you also see just, the wealth effect. What the Fed actually runs a lot of their modeling on is, the reason that they want to get asset prices down is because they know that it influences consumer behavior. It influences spending. It influences demand, consumer demand, and they want inflation down year over year, right? That's the politically most kind of prominent thing, is get inflation down domestically and really globally, but no one else really runs the monetary policy of the world like the Fed does. So, I would throw a big hike out there. It's not going to shock markets. I believe that 75 is priced in, that 50 is priced in. I'm not even sure. I should know this. I look at Eurodollar futures, which is basically the rates market for this almost daily. But yeah, bonds are setting new lows today, long dated bonds. So anybody that's been bullish bonds after the kind of the massacre that happened in June, is really you can look at Bitcoin's chart over the last since say May. You can weekly candles. You can look at treasury bonds. You can look at equities, or you can inverse the dollar index and look at that. And they're all telling you the same story. And so that's why I just remain quite pessimistic and bearish on the price. It's just it's global bubble of assets, this huge pool of assets, which Bitcoin is just still a tiny little pond over here. It's like a sideshow. that, the main show is there's a hurricane, and so like your pond, even if it's a really good pond, it's just not going to be able to withstand. That's just a terrible analogy, by the way, but it's just so tiny. Yeah, like I think that's the story here.
I get where you're trying to take that analogy. Let's go the other way though. Rather than filling this pond up, the U.S. just markets as a whole have had so much liquidity pumped into them pretty much since 2007, 2008. As we've seen pretty much over the last 15 years, anytime the Fed takes the liquidity out of the market responds justifiably with a nice little contraction heading down before inevitably the Fed does something to re-inject liquidity into the market. Rather than speculate on whether or not Jerome Powell has the balls or the gumption to actually unwind 15 years of liquidity, some of which he isn't even at fault for or had no part in participating in, do you think it's realistic for like the US to try and unwind all of it? Do you even think that amount of pain that would cause, would like the citizens, would people actually tolerate that? Would people get so upset to watch a full unwind all the way down to decrease the amount of liquidity that the Fed and the government has put into the public markets for the last 15 years?
Well, they're going to crash. They're going to crash global markets. That's what they're telling you. And it's not politically palatable. And they're going to probably, my current thesis, like market wise as a participant, is that they, something breaks. And so it forces them to step back in. And what I think that's Euro debt markets by the looks of the energy crisis. And then what comes next is probably the treasury market, because you have this global dollar shortage playing out as global economic activity and trade slows, the circulating supply of dollars slows with it. You have, I think, $15 trillion of global denominated debt offshore, and that's just the on balance sheet stuff. There's similar to how in the crypto Bitcoin markets, you could probably see like some transparent derivatives data and be like, hey, there's this amount of leverage, and it doesn't seem like it's all that bad. And then you come to find out that you have Three Arrows Capital that going and borrowing unsecured from everybody. You have this very opaque, that to kind of bridge the crypto analogy. The much bigger story here is you have this really, really opaque global debt based system, particularly offshore, where corporates, sovereigns, all the like, clearinghouses are negotiating and settling and invoicing each other in dollar assets, dollar liabilities, promises to pay dollars. So when this whole thing slows down, what happens is anybody that has dollar denominated debt just gets absolutely pummeled. And so the dollar screams higher, and there's defaults and all this, and the defaults exacerbate the problem further, because what happens during a default is money supply is destroyed. When the bond market sells off, when yields go higher, that money's just disappearing. Like there was $1 trillion of people thought was wealth or assets, and lower the next, at the open, and it's not there anymore. Like it didn't go anywhere. It's just destroyed. And so that's kind of the realities of a credit-based system. And I think the Fed, and it's not really the fault of the Fed or the fault of Powell or really any specific actor, but rather just the kind of incentive structures of debt-based monetary systems, governments, the voting structure in a democracy, and just the reality of fiat currencies is that they're going to take it too far. It's probably something's going to break in a massive way. And probably the treasury market at some point, it freezes or becomes a liquid, or, yields spike when they should be dropping, or whatever it may be. They pivoted in 2019 before COVID, and they started expanding their balance sheet again because of a repo issue, right? And so banks are more well capitalized today, but it's not maybe a banking system issue, rather just kind of this global margin call as Europe gets mauled. It could be really anything, and again, like it's not my total expertise, but just being a student of history and analyzing previous debt cycles where there was far less debt in the system and interest rates were at a starting point much higher. something always breaks in a debt crisis, and it it leads to more Fed easing, more central bank easing, and a real kind of devaluation of global currencies. I think where my kind of master thesis, the reason I honestly left college just to stack Bitcoin and to focus on Bitcoin as an asset before I even figured out, before I knew I was going to be working at Bitcoin Magazine, was that we're kind of at this end stage of a global debt bubble, global debt cycle, long-term debt cycle, and something's on the other side of it. And I don't think it's a new CBDC, and I don't think it's gold. And so, the optimist in me, the technologist in me, says that's Bitcoin, from everything that I can see. And it's going to take some time. There's going to be a ton of volatility along the way, and with that, a bunch of opportunity. So I think that's the long-term vision of all this.
I don't think any of us would necessarily disagree on that long-term vision. I am curious though, and not in a speculative manner, just potential ways for Bitcoin to usurp the dollar in the midst of what is about to be the dollar milkshake theory playing out. We're seeing Japan slowly collapse. We're talking right now about the inevitable collapse of the euro. The dollar milkshake theory would dictate that because all of these countries have debts denominated in USD, they will inevitably be forced to adopt the US dollar as their main form of currency. My question is, in this process, how or what are ways for Bitcoin to almost inject itself as the lifeboat for these different company or countries?
Yeah, it's tough. I think more kind of local adoption with like stuff with El Salvador, but just the reality is, that the dollar and the need for it at the moment is despite again the dollar falling in 10% in real purchasing power terms. There's so much demand for it because one, the largest economy in the world, the U.S., requires you to pay your taxes in it, legal tender laws, etc. But two, it's just there's so much dollar debt out there. So if you're indebted in the USD, you need to find a way to earn it, and you need to find a way to pay it, or else you as an entity, a corporate or a sovereign, are insolvent. And so I think because in a credit upswing, the upstart of a credit cycle, when there's kind of this reinforcement loop, positive reinforcement loop. Everybody's incomes are rising, assets are rising, debt's becoming cheaper, liquidity is improving, credit worthiness and conditions are easing. Dollars are abundant, and although the long term trend for dollars is like this, or the purchasing power is like this, it's sloping downwards. That's obvious. There's a bunch of boom and busts along the way, and kind of with the domestic credit cycle and really the international credit cycle. And so I think we're in kind of one of those downswings where actually, somewhat paradoxically, when inflation is 10%, aside from being, I guess, short a lot of risk assets, short bonds, there's obviously those trades you can make. But what's the best place to be in when globally, when inflation is 8, 9, 10%, 11%, 12%? Well, for a lot of people, and for most people, it's dollars, paradoxically, over the short term. Like this is just, and for even a stacker, right? You can have 50% of your net worth in Bitcoin. I wouldn't say, and as someone who's had 100% of my net worth in Bitcoin for a good part of my entire adult life, since the day I started earning a paycheck, I started stacking Bitcoin. Like it's okay to have dollars if you like understand how a credit-based system works in the short term, and your purchasing power in real asset terms, whether that's shares of the S&P or oil producers, or you can measure it in units of gold or whatever. You can measure it in Bitcoin. Your purchasing power in dollar terms during these periods can actually increase by a lot. If like stocks have fallen 20% or 19% or whatever it is, they can fall another 20%. Like Bitcoin dropped 80% from the highs. Volatility, the way this thing trades, the relative lack of liquidity compared to other global assets, like it can fall another 50%. And so there is, despite the long-term asymmetry of Bitcoin, like that's undeniable. And I literally bet a lot of my life on that thesis. Over the short term, there could be a ton of, and I would argue by far, actually, by a wide margin, dollars over the, say, next 6 months, in BTC terms, in S&P 500 terms, and in really anything terms, maybe even real estate, like whatever, it could be global credit, dollars, the asymmetry is so strong over the short term. Like you watch the Bitcoin chart and any bounce over the last, I mean, even when, a lot of the crypto ecosystem went up 100% off the lows. I get a lot of it's, scammy pump and dumps, but, ETH goes up 100%. S&P 500 goes up 20% or 25% off the lows. Bitcoin goes 43% off the lows, and it trades at 3x the historical volatility roughly, and 3x the implied volatility of equities. And it only bounced like not even double. And similarly, it's almost at its lows. And so it's like, yeah, I think there may be some short-term asymmetry in dollars. And the only reason I care is because on the other side of this thing, like the goal for me is to have as much Bitcoin as possible. Because I think that's in a decade of eroding globalization, in the end of a debt super cycle, the reality is over the longer term, the populace will literally demand, and governments, politicians will abide, central bankers will abide, to print the currency into oblivion. And so I think that's the end game. And for Bitcoin, you have a digital synthetic commodity, a monetary asset you can send anywhere in the world that has a marginal production cost that's just literally going straight up and to the right, with a ton of volatility. But the long-term trend, throw a moving average, you can't even calculate the marginal production cost because it's marginal. And so some people will produce it for zero input costs, whether it's waste gas or whatever it is. Maybe a waterfall, hydro, right? It doesn't cost anything to produce water. It's abundant, energy abundant, and it's not located near where humans are desiring it. There's this incentive just all over the world, mop up excess energy with Bitcoin mining. And so basically the marginal production cost, because of Bitcoin supply schedule, because of the difficulty adjustment, as hash rate goes to the moon, and as Moore's law kicks in and the miners get more efficient and better, and hash rate keeps going up, you're going to see the marginal production cost of Bitcoin programmatically tick up with it, as issuance goes to zero, and again, difficulty keeps ratcheting up. So I think that's like the upside is that we have this thing that nobody understands that trades like a total risk asset, and if it's a digital synthetic commodity that it credibly enforces monetary policy in a world where central banks have gone mad. Gold has been completely captured by paper markets. There's a reason it didn't succeed as money in global markets before. There's something potentially really big here, and that's where you can increase your purchasing power by a factor of 100 if the thesis is right over a 10, 15 year span. Yeah.
Beautifully said, Dylan. You almost reminded me, and I just wanted to get your quick thoughts of the dictator that runs this now terrible once great state of California decided over the last 2 weeks to ban gas cars, and then shortly thereafter ask everyone in the midst of our first heat wave of the year to not plug in said electric vehicles. When you see policy moves like this, just want to ask you, is California going to make it? Oh, you're muted.
I'm not gonna lie, I've never been to California, but probably not gonna make it. So
you heard it here first, folks. California is fucked.
This is true. This is true. Well, Dylan, as we wrap up here, I wanted to give you the opportunity to touch on anything else that we haven't touched on. I know that you and the Bitcoin Magazine Pro team have put out countless articles touching on much of the stuff we've talked about here today, as well as so many other things that just go on in the world and how it all relates back to Bitcoin. So I want to just give you the opportunity to touch on anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much more to add. If you're interested in any of the stuff I rambled on about today, make sure to check out BitcoinMagazinePro.com. It's Bitcoin Magazine Pro. You can find it in Substack if you already have the app. We've actually been getting a ton of native Substack recommendations lately, which is cool to see. It's there's a growing network of publishers and kind of content creators on Substack. It's a pretty cool thing. But we talk about it all. So, there's visuals. We just recently brought up Jeff Ross, who's going to be putting out basically live positioning for anyone that, if you want to stack sats and chill and just take in content, that's great. And Sam and I are going to be pumping that out. For the more active crowd, Jeff Ross is going to be putting out a pretty cool product. So for anyone that wants to see that, we recommend you give it a go. And thanks for having me on. This was a fun talk.
Dylan,
Absolutely,
thank
man.
you as always for joining us. And I cannot stress enough, guys. Bitcoin Magazine Pro is easily the best macro newsletter out there. There is a free version. It costs you no money at all, and you're going to get a lot smarter from reading the analysis of guys like Dylan, Sam, and Jeff Ross. So be sure to go subscribe now. I'm going to call it. Let's
do
just
it.
wrap.
My
Let's
friends,
wrap.
thanks again. See you tomorrow.